has had his finger on the pulse of this industry really since it started. I talked to him about, how did you start covering voice? And he said, because when I started to pay attention to what was going on with Alexa, I noticed nobody was really covering the space yet. Somebody needed to cover this space. He just jumped in and started doing it. Started doing the research, asking the questions, and then presenting that back to the industry. And suddenly today, here 3 years later, VoiceBot has become an indispensable part of our industry. How many go to voicebot.ai to see what's going on? Right. How many of the big companies now realize they have to get their information to voicebot.ai first in order for it to be validated? So I asked Bret to leave us with some parting thoughts today. Voice with 2020 hindsight, very, very appropriately named. Give it up for Bret Kinsella. Thank you, Bret.
Okay, so we're going to move fast. I'm going to try to keep a little bit of time for questions. I think people probably want to go and eat or drink or take a nap or something. But I do want to cover a few things about what I think are really going to be interesting, not only over the next year, but over the next decade. And I'm going to take this from a brand perspective. And I was thinking about it. I know there's a lot of people in the industry here today, and there's a number of brands as well. But what I do understand is almost everybody here is either a brand or enterprise, or they're working with a brand or enterprise. So I want to give the perspective of how I talk to brands or enterprises about what I think is happening in this space based on all the information you all have given me, right? So between consumer surveys and the conversations with you, that's where I've come up with a lot of these findings. And so that's where we come in to the 2020 with a little bit of hindsight. For those of you who don't know us, we do lots of things. There's a podcast. You can find me on the Twitter there. And so, I recommend you do that. All right. So let's talk about something that very few people pay much attention to or enough attention to. There's lots of voice assistants out there. They're across multiple surfaces. This data is as of end of September, so end of Q3 2019. And this is US. So we'll just talk about US first. And we see smart speakers at the bottom. Much smaller in terms of total usage trial than the other surfaces. So if you're a brand and you're thinking about this, you need to be thinking about surfaces beyond the smart speaker. You need to think particular about the car and around the phone. And the phone is an extension, I would say, the earbuds. We had a really interesting presentation just now. You need to do that. Now, the one other thing I'll point out here, we've got two things. The first bar is how many people have tried it. And you see there's twice as many people who have tried voice on a smartphone as they've tried it on a smart speaker. However, when you look at monthly active users, it's actually much narrower in terms of the difference. Monthly active users on smartphones are only about 50% higher than on smart speakers, and you're going to see that continue to come down before it expands, because we're going to start seeing voice assistants on smartphones really expand significantly. And that's one of the key trends to start to think about over the next year or two. If you are a brand and you're going to have a voice strategy, you have to have a mobile strategy. And mobile here is the phone, it's the earbuds, it's the watch, devices around your peripheral, and it's the car. These are global numbers. So the other thing is we're approaching 3 billion voice assistants out there. One of the things that kills most technologies, AR, VR, for example, if anybody's heard of those. We've been hearing about those for years. They have not had distribution, right? Voice assistants have distribution. That's a really important thing. And we also heard from Google this week that they have 500 million monthly active users. So this isn't just pre-installed. There's actually people starting to use this. And that goes back to that last conversation or that last point I just made. You better start thinking about mobile. A lot of those 500 million are actually on mobile. But what does this mean ultimately? Microphones are everywhere. So as a brand, what is your strategy to take advantage of microphones? And that's what I want to talk to you about today. So we're going to talk about the voice assistant landscape. And a few people don't understand, I think, how broad this landscape is. So I have this really simple little framework that I like to show people. We talk about Alexa, Google Assistant, Siri, Bixby. That's the general purpose voice assistant space, the consumer voice assistant space. But as you can see, it's not the whole landscape. And so I have some descriptors here. Is it platform controlled, enterprise controlled, broad scope, narrow feature scope? I don't need to get into a lot of that at the moment, but you have this understanding that there's a lot of different applications and a lot of different ways people are going to interact with voice. So I name these other three quadrants: niche, owned, and white label. And in niche, we've got these things. If you think about it, they're like a voice assistant, but they're for a very specific thing. Voicea just got purchased a few months ago by Cisco, and that they capture all of your meeting content, and then there's an assistant that actually takes notes for you and those types of things. Aria AI, they do all your back office for small businesses. So that's a niche. They're a lot like the Amazon Alexa. Aria is like the Amazon Alexa if you're a small business and you need back office, right? And you need to be able to talk to it. But then on the bottom, we have all these things, which I would just categorize in the bottom left and the bottom right is your custom voice assistant landscape. And this is going to be important because I'm going to talk to you about what that actually means. On the left, think about if you're building your own. Those are the people who have put all the components together. Now, they haven't built all the components themselves. They've sourced them, but they've really had to do a lot of work. They've basically got unfinished products, integrated them together to make it work. And then on the lower right, you have all of the white label solutions. SoundHound's a good example of that. They're in the back today. And what they do is they provide you with most of what you need, and then you do mostly configuring. Okay? And so that's a faster way to market. Cerence and Nuance have been big on this in different areas. Houndify, and there's a few others. Microsoft Bot Framework's the one in the lower right. Okay, what does this mean? On the top, if you're a brand, you should think about those as channels. So here's an analogy. A few years ago, Facebook, Twitter, subsequently Snap, Instagram became popular. And brands didn't control those, but they recognized that those organizations had amassed large consumer audiences. So all of a sudden they developed strategies for each of those because these are their channels in order to reach these different, reach consumers at a time when they're doing something that might be relevant to their, right? So you ignore social media at your channel, at your peril, and you ignore as a brand or an enterprise, you ignore Alexa and Google Assistant and some of these other players also at your peril. So that's one of the things you have to see. There is such widespread adoption that you need to think about that as part of your strategy. On the lower level, you think about these custom assistants. That's about capabilities. That's about extending your product experience. And a really good example of this is Bank of America. So some people have talked about this. I'm the only ones reported on this. Have said they spent $60 million over 2 years. It seems like a lot of money, and it seems like it's out of reach for brands. But if you look at someone like Bank of America, they did it all on their own. So they did the most expensive way they could. They went in the route that they are in an industry where regulation and the lawyers determine a lot of things. 8 million users, that's about a third of all the users of the Bank of America app in the US have actually tried it. So pretty good trial rate. They've got 500,000 to 1 million MAUs. And so if you think about the cost for them, if they just reduce one call to their call center a year, they've probably paid for this, right? For all of your users. So you start to think about it, there's a pretty good value proposition for that. The other thing is they're really extending the product and service experience. So today, there's only a certain amount of things you can do, and what they're doing is they're expanding beyond that. One of the big things they saw, and you see this at Capital One as well, they have so much in their mobile app, consumers can't find it. They don't know what's there. They don't know how to get to it. What do they wind up doing? We heard it earlier, millennials, they make a phone call, right? Because who wants to go through and search and type it all in? It's a lot easier to make a phone call, except for if you've got Eno or Erica or something like that, you can just ask them. And they see time and again that this makes a big difference. Now, they're not the only ones. We've seen a lot about Mercedes. I won't go into great detail on this, but again, we're talking about being able to control that user experience, be able to extend the cabin experience for drivers. That's something that Mercedes, BMW, a lot of the big players do not want to cede to some other organization. Whether they feel good or bad about Amazon or Samsung, it doesn't really matter. They know that they have a specific type of product experience they want to enable, and that's why they're doing this. So Stanley Black & Decker has Priya, in the healthcare space. Again, an assistant that will recognize a person, will dispense their drugs for them, will be able to report back to loved ones and caretakers that medications have actually been taken. So you think about Stanley Healthcare, they were doing cabinets in hospitals. Now they're essentially a medication cabinet in the home. Right? But yet it has all these other capabilities where they can interact and they can create a bond with the user. They can provide more social and emotional support beyond just the transaction. So again, there's a lot going on here. And then we think about Jingo and Magenta. And Raghu's here from Deutsche Telekom's. I didn't know he was here. I was very thrilled to meet him today. What did they want to do? They wanted to create a better Deutsche Telekom experience. The same thing with Orange in France. They didn't want to just say, I'll take what Google or Amazon gives me. There's certain types of things, there's certain features that I want to enable so that I can extend my product experience. And that led them to building their own smart speaker, and I understand it's going well. And they also use Alexa for all the things that they're not going to do, but for their product experience, things that Alexa or Google were never going to do for them, they're able to do that now. And to be able to leverage voice as an interaction mechanism, particularly for someone in the home who's providing television and entertainment services, who's providing telecom services, this is a really useful product extension for them. And we see other telecoms doing this too. Aura is Telefonica's solution as well. And we see SK Telecom and KT in Korea, South Korea. So we're seeing this over and over again in terms of these private assistants. And then a lot of people were really surprised. The BBC, who has been among the earliest and most aggressive adopters on some of the consumer platforms that we saw in the upper right-hand corner. You all know how to think about this market now. But they said, you know what, we're going to actually build our own assistant called the Beeb, and it's going to help us with media search, and we're going to be able to tailor the experience, and we're going to enable it on the web and on mobile and other places. Roll that out this year. Okay, so people is Amazon and Google just showed brands how valuable it is to have a voice assistant relationship with a consumer, right? They're investing a lot in it because they understand there's a lot of benefit, and brands and enterprises have the exact same opportunity in front of them with this. And it's a lot easier than it used to be because we have some of those white labels, because the maturity of some of the individual tools are better. Spend $60 million anymore. You can do this actually at a pretty reasonable budget. And think about it as part of your product. Don't think about it as part of necessarily just your marketing. So for people who are doing these things, I also want to point ahead and let you know where you're headed. So Amazon, Alexa, Google Assistant, they moved on from this voice interface. And by the way, I think a lot of brands should be doing these things, just like this voice interface. Can I make it easier to have? But this assistant is really just much more robust, deeper level of connection and value to customers. But they're also moving on to these concepts of virtual agents. Dan Miller likes to talk about this, Opus Research, so I like to look at his material from time to time. Google Duplex, perfect example of virtual agent. A virtual agent, any of these types of things, we talk about agency for voice assistants. That means they can do things on your behalf without your explicit request, okay? So that's one of the things that we're heading for with these devices. You see Ring doorbell with the doorbell concierge come to your front door, and Alexa's gonna have not even home, they'll tell the person where to put the package. Message, all these other types of things. They're doing things for you. So right now, voice assistants are about request response. You have to be there. You have to ask for it. Now you'll be able to basically set these things up, and they will go out and they will do things for you when you're not there. And we even saw this, we saw a new one. So you can tell how people are thinking about this right now in the industry and how important they think it are. This is Samsung Bali. For those of you who haven't seen it, I think most people here probably have heard about it because it's one of the more interesting things out there. I don't know if this will be successful. I'm a bit of a skeptic on robots in general, but this is more interesting than things like Jibo, which actually they look cool. The anthropomorphism is really great, but this thing actually could be really useful. And one of the key aspects of it that they showed was agency. They showed it doing things in your home when you're not there to make the home better when you arrive, right? So you don't have to do anything about it. So I like to point that out to people. The other thing, since we're at CES, and CES is truly a global conference, I just wanted to point out a couple quick things, just so everyone in this room has this in top of mind. We talk a lot about the global consumer voice assistants, so you'll know where they are and the types in the countries that they serve in terms of languages. But we have also these regional voice assistants that are really coming into their own. And I think we're going to see a lot more of that. I was having a conversation earlier today with someone about whether it'll be one assistant or many assistants. I've always been in the many assistants category. So I There's some people in the market like Jeff Bezos who's always been in that. There's other people like Adam Chire who's always been in the run assistant market. My view is that we're going to have many assistants. And if you've read Voice Insider, my newsletter, you'll know that I think of voice assistants today as like apps. Voice assistants are going to be the new apps. And we're going to use multiple of them just like we use multiple apps. That might evolve over time, but that's where we're heading in the next 4 to 5 years. So there's lots of other players. They tend to be regionally or country focused. If you are a global enterprise, you should be thinking about that, right? Because these are other channels that are going to be successful because of their cultural focus and alignment in a way that the general voice assistants won't get to eventually because they don't do that language or they're not as focused on a specific type of domain or interaction. And so then you've got the whole landscape, and then I'm just going to finish this up. Tross and Backlash. So there's been a lot of talk about privacy. Is that hurting the industry? There's been talk about consumers aren't adopting voice apps and Alexa skills as quickly as I would like. And so there's this thought of this trough of disillusionment. If you're not familiar with this is the Gartner hype cycle where new technologies come in. Everyone's really excited about them. Oh, the potential, but then they overhype it. And then all of a sudden you can't meet the expectations. And then all of a sudden everyone says, oh, this is terrible. Everyone was a moron. This will never go anywhere. But then usually what happens if it's not VR, it comes out of the trough of disillusionment and then it goes up to this plateau of productivity. In other words, people figure out ways and it's where we should have been. We should have had this technology trigger and gone, nice little thing, but this is the way it generally works because we're humans and we think we make decisions logically, but we don't. We make them emotionally and eventually we figure it out. Okay, so there's a lot of question about, hey, have things like the concerns around privacy, have they impacted voice adoption? And I'll say, maybe. So in January 2019, I saw that of people who, 1,000 people in the US, this is just US, there's gonna be a different answer if you go to the UK, but of the people who was very concerned about voice assistant and privacy, it's 26% in January, it's 29.5% in September, so it rose. But it did not rise as much as you might think based on the headlines that we saw. So what happened this year? Amazon contractors shared transcripts of interactions with Alexa. Siri contractor did the same thing. Google Assistant, Line, if anyone knows Line from Asia, same thing happened. Microsoft, Apple, Facebook, got nailed over a 4-month period, and it went up 3%. Okay? So to me, that's interesting, right? Because there was more attention paid to it. So people are starting to think, hey, maybe I should be very concerned about this. But as we heard from Tom this morning, and my data as well, shows just a little bit difference. If you're very concerned, you're still going to buy a smart speaker. You're still going to use a voice assistant. So I'm not sure that that's a big deal. And after this all came out, so Q3 numbers, Amazon had its best non-Q4, so 1 through 3, quarter ever, right? They did 10 million smart globally in that quarter. So despite the fact that people said, Alexa is listening to your conversation, you're concerned about your privacy, they wound up having the next quarter their best non-Q4 quarter, right? Because Q4 is holiday, it's a whole different deal. But they did well. And so we're not seeing yet data that's saying, hey, consumers are stepping off the gas, right? All right, so the other thing is if you are a brand, if you can say, hey, I don't think the privacy thing is going to derail this, but what are other people doing in this space? Other people like big brands who are forward leaders in their a lot of money in this space. They really have committed to it because they're starting to see benefit. And so I'll point one out. Does anybody know how many Echo Autos nationwide has committed to distributing to their customers? 1 million. So that's a great quarter for Amazon anytime that comes out. But they said, listen, people are in the car. I want them to be able to interact with the app. I want them to take advantage of my services. I'm going to put those out. And so that's something that's really interesting. That's I'm sure they're buying at volume. That's a $50 item, right? So let's say they got it at bulk. That's $25 million that they've decided to spend in order to have a greater experience. But then we have Mercedes, which you guys heard from. We have Starbucks, which is big on voice commerce. We have Orange and Deutsche Telekom. We have BBC. People are saying, hey, this is the new platform. And there's a whole nother talk I give about platform shifts and things like that. You can go to Harvard Business Review and you can see basically the summary of that. And I think you'll find that interesting if you want to understand the historical context. But if you want to think about right now what's happening, there's a lot of people using voice. There's great distribution. They're increasing their frequency of use. And the people who are actually leaders in technology adoption that helps drive business are spending a lot of money. Okay, so let's finish up. Recommendations for brands. I tell them not to be silent. Because if you're silent, then there is no opportunity for you to be in a conversation. Your best chance is that the voice assistant takes you takes the consumer to Wikipedia. Very often, they take the consumer to one of your brand competitors or something else, or say they don't know the answer, and you've lost that moment. So I do this whole thing around moments. People who've been through my voice strategy sessions know this. Owning that moment, you can't own it if you're silent. So don't be silent. You need to have a strategy here. And when you think about the strategy, I tell people you need to think portfolio. You can't just think smart speaker. You shouldn't just think phone. You shouldn't just think car. You should think about all of the above, because this is the way things are going. You need to be on mobile. You need to be on the web. You need to be on voice, and you need to have an experience that makes sense. And more, you need to be able to do these multimodal interactions. The phone is a good example. So that it's not voice only, it's voice plus. And you need to be prepared for that going forward. And I do really stress this idea of being multimodal and being mobile when you think about your voice strategy. And the other thing is, go ahead and build your own assistant. In fact, in 2020, start to spec out what your objectives are. Maybe design it if you're an early adopter. If you're not, at least set your objectives so that in 2021, 2022, you're not left behind. If you haven't seen voicebot.ai, check out /research on our site. That's how you find me on social. And the Voice Insider newsletter, I think a lot of people in this room would probably get a lot out of. It's where we talk about the things that aren't just news. It's not a long form interview. It's about the things, the information, the topics that we're talking about today that are like deep in, if you're in the industry and really want to understand what's going on, then that's a place to get that. And that is Voice with 2020 Hindsight.